A mountain man married the virgin no one dared to touch, then burst into tears when he learned the reason why. Under the gray sky of a Colorado mining town, a rough, bearded loner steps from the crowd and does the unthinkable. He claims the trembling young woman everyone else spits at. The preacher's hand shakes as he pronounces them husband and wife, while the townsfolk whisper about curses and death. Up in the mountains, his cabin burns with lamplight and silence. She prays by the fire. He listens, heart pounding with something he's long forgotten. Hope. But when her secret breaks under the weight of snow and sickness, the man who feared nothing faces the one thing he can't fight. The truth. What kind of woman could turn a hardened trapper into a weeping man of faith? And when love itself becomes a test of courage, will he cling to fear or touch the untouchable, even if it breaks his heart forever? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Under slate-gray skies, Mateo Creed guided his wagon down the muddy main street of Henry Hollow. The late March wind whistled between the weathered buildings, carrying the sharp scent of melting snow and wet pine. His horse's hooves made sucking sounds in the half-frozen muck as townsfolk hurried past, collars turned up against the mountain chill. The winter's harvest of beaver and fox pelts lay carefully bundled in the wagon bed behind him. 4 months of solitude in the high country had left his beard wild and his clothes trail-worn, but his eyes remained sharp as he took in the changed atmosphere of the town. Henry Hollow had grown since autumn. More miners' shacks dotted the hillsides, and the clang of hammers echoed from the new assayer's office being built near the mercantile. As he passed the livery stable, raised voices caught his attention. A crowd had gathered outside Hawkins' general store, their angry murmurs carrying on the wind. Through the press of bodies, Mateo glimpsed a slight figure in a faded blue dress, backed against the store's front wall. "Ain't natural, the way folks take sick after she tends them," someone called out. "My Tommy caught the cough right after she mended his shirt," came another voice. Mateo pulled his wagon to a stop, recognition dawning as he saw Mary Ellen Shaw's pale face. The young seamstress stood straight-backed despite her trembling, clutching her worn Bible to her chest. Her brown hair had escaped its pins in the wind, and her eyes were wide but dry. Sheriff Wade Morton pushed through the crowd, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Miss Shaw, we've been patient, but when decent folks start falling ill—" "I bring no sickness." Mary Ellen's voice was soft but clear. "I only wish to earn my way with honest work." "Consumption runs in her blood," Preacher Garrison declared from the edge of the gathering. His black coat flapped in the wind as he pointed an accusing finger. "She's marked by the Lord's judgment, untouchable." Mateo's jaw tightened at the preacher's words. He'd seen enough of judgment in the war, enough of fear turning neighbors cruel. Swinging down from the wagon seat, he stepped into the crowd. "Seems to me the only sickness here is meanness of spirit," he said, his quiet voice carrying across the sudden hush. Heads turned, taking in his weathered appearance and the Navy Colt on his hip. Sheriff Morton's hand drifted toward his own weapon. "This ain't your business, Creed. Town's decided she's got to go, for everyone's safety. Asylum at Pueblo will take her kind." "Her kind?" Mateo's eyes hardened. "A God-fearing woman who tends the sick and mends your children's clothes. That the kind you mean, Sheriff?" "Now see here," Morton began, but Mateo cut him off. "No, you see here." He moved to stand beside Mary Ellen, whose composure had finally cracked enough to let tears shine in her eyes. "I've watched this town shame itself with fear these past years. Watched good people turn their backs on Christian charity. It stops today." The crowd shifted uneasily as Matteo turned to Mary Ellen. Though they'd barely exchanged more than pleasantries in the past, he saw in her face the same lonely courage he'd known in the mountains, the strength to stand alone against winter storms and human cruelty alike. "Miss Shaw," he said quietly, "I reckon you need a protector, and I need a wife. If you're willing, we can solve both problems right here." A gasp went through the onlookers. Mary Ellen's eyes widened as she searched his face, looking for mockery or deceit. Finding neither, she whispered, "You know what they say about me, about the consumption in my family." "I know what they say," Matteo answered. "I also know the Lord judges hearts, not rumors. Will you have me?" For a long moment, only the wind spoke. Then Mary Ellen straightened her shoulders and nodded once, dignity in every line of her bearing. "Preacher," Matteo called, not taking his eyes from Mary Ellen's face. "You're here already. Marry us." Preacher Garrison sputtered. "This is highly irregular. There should be bans posted, proper ceremonies." "Ain't nothing proper about threatening to send an innocent woman to an asylum," Matteo countered. "You want to make this right? Marry us now." The sheriff started forward. "Now hold on. No law against two free people joining in matrimony," Matteo said evenly, "unless you aim to draw on me for wanting to wed." A fine drizzle began to fall as the sheriff backed down, scowling. The preacher looked between the couple and the crowd, his conscience visibly warring with his fear of scandal. Finally, he opened his prayer book with trembling hands. "Join hands," he instructed, his voice barely carrying over the wet wind. Matteo's calloused fingers engulfed Mary Ellen's smaller ones. Her hand was cold but steady as they faced each other in the gray afternoon light. The crowd drew back, forming an uneasy circle as Preacher Garrison began the abbreviated ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God." The words washed over them like the drizzle, ancient promises spoken in halting tones. When asked if he would take this woman as his lawful wedded wife, Matteo's "I will" rang clear and firm. Mary Ellen's response was softer, but no less certain. No rings were exchanged. There had been no time to prepare. But when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Matteo felt the weight of the moment settle around them like a mantle. Without ceremony, he led his new bride to the wagon, helping her up onto the seat before climbing up beside her. The crowd parted silently as he took up the reins. Sheriff Morton stood with his arms crossed, jaw working as though he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Preacher Garrison had already turned away, shoulders hunched against more than just the weather. As the wagon rolled past the last buildings of Henry Hollow, neither Matteo nor Mary Ellen spoke. The only sounds were the creak of wood and leather, the horses' steady hoofbeats, and the soft patter of rain. The mountain trail stretched ahead, winding up through pine and aspen toward Matteo's cabin in the high country. Mary Ellen sat rigid beside him, her Bible still clutched to her chest, her body trembling slightly, though she made no sound. Matteo kept his eyes on the trail, giving her what privacy he could in this strange moment they'd created. He'd acted on instinct and righteous anger, but now the reality of their situation began to settle in. They were practical strangers, bound together by desperation and defiance, heading into the wilderness as man and wife. The rain fell steadier as they climbed, dripping from the brim of Matteo's hat and darkening Mary Ellen's shawl. Neither of them spoke of what lay ahead, of the challenges they would face. For now, it was enough to put distance between themselves and the judgment of Henry Hollow, to trust that God would light the path before them, one step at a time. Behind them, the town grew smaller and smaller, until it was swallowed by the gathering dusk and the curtain of rain. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility. the chance for two wounded souls to find healing in the high, wild places where God's mercy still moved like wind through the pines. The wagon creaked onward through the gloom, carrying its passengers toward whatever future awaited them in the mountains above Henry Hollow. Though they sat close enough to touch, both Mateo and Mary Ellen remained wrapped in their own thoughts, their shared silence filled with equal measures of trepidation and hope. The wagon creaked up the last steep stretch of mountain trail as dusk settled over the Colorado highlands. Mateo guided the tired horses carefully through the mud and melting snow, while Mary Ellen sat silently beside him, her thin shawl pulled tight against the mountain chill. The day's rain had finally ceased, leaving behind a heavy mist that clung to the pine branches. Around a final bend, Mateo's cabin came into view, a sturdy log structure nestled in a small clearing. Smoke-blackened stones rose above the shake roof, where the chimney stood sentinel against the darkening sky. A rough-hewn fence marked off a small corral, and stacked firewood lined the cabin's western wall. Mary Ellen's breath caught slightly as they drew closer. This remote outpost would be her home now, for better or worse. The thought seemed to settle heavily on her shoulders as Mateo brought the wagon to a halt. "It ain't much," he said quietly, "but it's dry and warm inside." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the evening wind. "I'm much obliged for your kindness, Mr. Creed." "Mateo," he corrected gently, helping her down from the wagon. She kept careful distance between them, her movements precise and contained despite her obvious exhaustion. The cabin's interior was simple but orderly. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its black iron cooking pot hanging ready. Two built-in bunks occupied the opposite wall, one larger, one smaller. Shelves lined with glass jars of preserved goods stretched between rough-hewn support beams. A solid table with two chairs stood in the center, and a rocking chair faced the hearth. The scents of pine smoke, leather, and dried herbs filled the space. "The smaller bunk was Clara's sewing nook," Mateo said, then fell silent, the name of his late wife hanging in the air between them. He cleared his throat. "It's yours now. I'll fetch your things while I stable the mule." Mary Ellen nodded, clutching her Bible closer as she took in her new surroundings. When Mateo returned with her carpet bag and sewing basket, she had not moved from her spot near the door. "Best get a fire going," he said, moving to the hearth. "Nights get cold up here." Soon flames crackled to life, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Mateo busied himself with cooking, letting Mary Ellen settle in her own time. He could hear her soft movements as she arranged her few possessions in the small bunk space. The familiar routine of preparing a meal helped ease some of the awkwardness that filled the cabin. Mateo added salt pork to the pot of beans he'd left soaking that morning, then sliced thick pieces of bacon. The sizzling fat and warming beans gradually filled the space with homely scents. When the food was ready, he filled 2 tin plates and set them on the table. "It ain't fancy, but it'll warm you up." Mary Ellen approached the table carefully, like a wild creature unsure of welcome. "Thank you," she said again, settling into one of the chairs. They ate in silence, the clink of spoons against tin plates the only sound besides the popping fire. Mateo noticed how she ate slowly, with small, careful bites, though she must have been hungry after the long journey. Her manners spoke of better days, of a life before illness and hardship had marked her path. He wondered what dreams she'd had before consumption took her family and left her alone in the world. After the meal, Mary Ellen insisted on washing the dishes despite her evident fatigue. Her movements were growing stiffer, but determination showed in the set of her jaw. When she finished, She turned to Mateo with quiet dignity. "I should retire, if you don't mind. It's been a long day." "Of course," he replied. "There's extra quilts in the chest if you need them." She disappeared behind the curtain she'd hung around the smaller bunk, and soon the soft rustle of blankets told him she'd settled in for the night. Mateo remained in his chair by the fire, feeding it occasional pieces of wood as the hours crept past. His thoughts turned to Clara, as they often did in the night hours. What would she think of what he'd done today? His impulsive marriage to a stranger had been born of righteous anger and compassion. But now, in the quiet dark, doubts crept in. Had he done right by this gentle woman, bringing her to this lonely place? Or had he condemned them both to a life of awkward misery? The fire burned low as midnight approached. Mateo stayed in his chair rather than taking to his bunk, not wanting to disturb Mary Ellen's rest. He dozed fitfully, waking at every small sound. The settling of logs in the fireplace, the wind in the pines outside, the soft breathing of his new wife behind her curtain. Dawn came early to the mountains, painting the cabin's small windows with pale light. Mateo woke from his uncomfortable doze to find Mary Ellen already up and dressed. She stood by the door with the water bucket in hand. "The well's just beyond the woodpile," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Watch your step. Path's slick with mud." She nodded and slipped outside. Through the window, he watched her pick her way carefully to the well. Despite her obvious weariness, she maintained that same quiet dignity he'd noticed yesterday. When she reached the well, she set about drawing water with practiced movements, humming softly to herself. The morning sun caught in her hair as she worked, turning the pale brown strands to gold. For a moment, the sight stirred something in Mateo's chest, a forgotten warmth, quickly pushed aside. He had married her to protect her, nothing more. Any other feelings would only complicate an already difficult situation. After a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee, Mateo prepared to check his trap lines. The morning's tasks felt strange with another person in the cabin, watching his movements with those careful eyes. "I'll be gone most of the morning," he told her as he pulled on his coat. "There's dried meat in the jar on the middle shelf if you get hungry, and the rifle above the door is loaded, though we don't get much trouble up here." "I'll be fine," she assured him softly. "I have my sewing to keep me occupied." Mateo nodded and stepped out into the crisp morning air. As he walked the familiar trail to his first trap site, his thoughts remained back at the cabin. The morning sun was warm on his face, but his mind was troubled. Had he done right by her? Only time would tell if their hasty marriage would bring healing or heartache to them both. The sound of Mary Ellen's hymn still echoed in his memory as he checked his first trap. Her voice had been sweet and clear, though touched with sadness. Perhaps, he thought, that was fitting for them both. Two lonely souls seeking something like peace in these high mountains, each carrying their own burden of grief and fear. He worked his way along the trap line, trying to focus on the familiar tasks rather than the uncertainty waiting back at the cabin. But every so often, his thoughts would drift to Mary Ellen, to her quiet strength, and the way she'd faced the town's cruelty with such grace. He found himself hoping she would find some measure of peace here in the mountains, even if their marriage was built more on necessity than love. The morning wore on as Mateo tended his traps, each step taking him further from the cabin, while his thoughts remained fixed on its newest occupant. The sun climbed higher in the Colorado sky, promising another fair spring day in the high country, where two wounded souls now shared a home, if not yet a life. The day settled into a gentle rhythm at the mountain cabin, Each sunrise brought new tasks and careful steps in this delicate dance between two strangers bound by marriage, but separated by their own private griefs. Mary Ellen rose early each morning, determination driving her despite her frail health. She discovered a broom behind the door and put it to good use, sweeping away the winter's accumulation of dust and pine needles. The simple act of cleaning seemed to give her purpose, and gradually the cabin took on a more ordered appearance. One morning, while Mateo was out checking his trap lines, she ventured outside to explore the cabin's surroundings. The spring thaw had begun in earnest, revealing patches of earth beneath the melting snow. Near the south wall of the cabin, she found remnants of what had once been a vegetable patch. Wooden stakes still marked the borders, though they leaned at awkward angles after years of neglect. She knelt in the mud, her fingers probing the soil. Despite years of abandonment, the earth was rich and dark. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, already planning what seeds she might plant when the ground softened further. Inside, she found Mateo's clothes needed attention. His shirts bore the marks of hard use, torn seams, missing buttons, patches worn thin at the elbows. She set up her sewing basket near the window, where the morning light was strongest, and began the familiar work of mending. The quiet hours passed peacefully as her needle dipped and rose, making neat stitches that would hold fast. Mateo kept his distance, more comfortable with the solitude of the forest than the newfound company in his home. He left before dawn, most days returning with rabbits or the occasional grouse for their meals, but small changes in his behavior revealed a growing awareness of his wife's presence. He began wiping his boots more carefully before entering the cabin. He stacked fresh-cut firewood closer to the door so she wouldn't have to carry it as far. The air between them gradually softened, like spring snow yielding to sunshine. Mary Ellen found herself humming old hymns as she worked, something she hadn't done since leaving Kansas. The familiar melodies filled the cabin with a gentle sound that made the space feel less empty. One evening, as she stirred a pot of venison stew Mateo had provided, she heard his boots on the porch. He entered carrying an armload of kindling and paused, listening to her song. "That's right pretty," he said quietly, setting down the wood. Mary Ellen's cheeks colored slightly. "My mother taught me that one. We used to sing while we worked." Mateo nodded, then surprised her by adding, "Smells good. Been a while since these walls heard singing." The stew simmered slowly, filling the cabin with rich aromas of meat, wild onions, and the dried herbs she'd found hanging from the rafters. When she ladled it into bowls, Mateo offered a gruff but sincere, "Much obliged." They ate in what felt like a more comfortable silence than usual. The wind whispered through the pine boughs outside, and the fire crackled steadily in the hearth. Mary Ellen found herself studying the cabin's rough-hewn walls, the careful joinery at the corners, the neat rows of preserves on the shelves. "I used to dream of a home like this," she said softly, almost to herself. "Something small and snug, away from town gossip, somewhere peaceful." Mateo looked up from his bowl, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Homes don't come easy in the mountains," he replied after a long moment. "Winter's hard, summer's short. Takes grit to make it here." She nodded, understanding the warning in his words. "I reckon peace is worth the price." After they finished eating, and she'd washed the dishes, Mary Ellen hesitated by her curtained bunk. The question had been building in her mind for days, and finally she found the courage to ask it. "Do you pray, Mr. Creed?" Mateo stiffened slightly in his chair by the fire. "Used to," he muttered, not looking at her. "Before Clara passed. Haven't found much cause since then." Instead of pressing him further, Mary Ellen knelt beside her bunk. Her clear voice carried softly through the cabin as she prayed, thanking the Lord for shelter, for food, for the kindness of a stranger who'd become her husband. She asked for blessing on their home and healing for their hearts. The wind rattled the shutters as she prayed, but her voice remained steady. Mateo sat motionless in his chair, head bowed, perhaps listening, perhaps lost in his own thoughts. When she finished with a quiet "Amen," the silence felt different somehow, less empty, more like peace. Morning came with the sound of Mateo's axe splitting wood outside. Mary Ellen lay in her bunk for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of the blows. His strength and capability were evident in everything he did, yet there was a gentleness, too, hidden beneath his gruff exterior. She'd seen it in the way he handled injured animals from his traps, in how he always made sure she had enough firewood, in his awkward but genuine thanks for her small contributions to their shared life. The sound of the axe continued as she dressed and began preparing breakfast. Through the window she could see him working, his breath visible in the cool morning air. Her prayer from the night before seemed to linger in the cabin, softening the sharp edges of their separate solitudes. As she stirred the morning porridge, she began humming again, an old hymn about grace and redemption. The melody mixed with the sound of the axe, creating an odd harmony that filled the mountain morning with something that felt, ever so slightly, like hope. Days continued to pass in this way, each one adding another small layer of familiarity to their shared existence. Mary Ellen's touch could be seen in the growing tidiness of the cabin, in the mended clothes Mateo now wore, in the seedlings she carefully tended in the revived vegetable patch. Mateo's presence was equally evident in the steady supply of food, the well-maintained tools, the security that allowed her to sleep peacefully in this remote place. They were not husband and wife in any real sense. The space between them remained too wide for that. But they were no longer entirely strangers either. Something was growing between them, as subtle as the spring thaw, a mutual respect, a careful consideration of each other's needs, a shared appreciation for the quiet rhythm of mountain life. Each morning brought its own small victories. Mary Ellen found she could work longer without tiring, her body gradually adapting to the mountain air. Mateo began lingering a bit longer over meals, occasionally offering brief comments about the weather or his trap lines. Their lives had begun to intertwine in simple, practical ways. Her cooking using the game he provided, his strength making her work easier, their shared space becoming more truly a home through their combined efforts. And each evening, Mary Ellen's prayers filled the cabin with words of gratitude and hope, while Mateo sat silent in his chair, perhaps remembering when he too had believed in such things. The mountain winds continued to rattle the shutters, but inside their cabin, something fragile and new was taking root, nurtured by respect, routine, and the quiet faith of a woman who refused to stop singing. The spring morning dawned clear and crisp, with sunlight filtering through the pine branches around Mateo's cabin. Mary Ellen was hanging freshly washed shirts on a line strung between two trees when the sound of hoofbeats echoed up the mountain trail. She paused, cloth pins in hand, watching as a rider emerged from the forest shadow. Mateo stepped out of the barn, his hand resting casually near his belt. The rider came into full view, Deputy Holt from Henry Hollow, his tin star catching the morning light. He rode a bay horse laden with supply sacks, his official manner somewhat diminished by the dust of the trail. "Morning, Creed," the deputy called out, dismounting with a grunt. "Brought them supplies you ordered from the mercantile." His eyes slid past Mateo to where Mary Ellen stood by the wash line. She lowered her gaze and stepped back towards the cabin's doorway. Matteo nodded curtly. "Much obliged. Coffee's hot inside if you need some before heading back." The deputy tied his horse to the rail and followed Matteo into the cabin. Mary Ellen moved quietly around the side of the house, gathering the remaining laundry, but stayed within earshot of the open door. Inside, cups clinked against the rough wooden table as Matteo poured the coffee. Deputy Holt settled heavily into a chair, removing his hat. "Town's been mighty stirred up since you left," he said, blowing steam from his cup. "Folks can't stop talking about your sudden marriage." "Ain't there business to discuss?" Matteo replied flatly. The deputy leaned forward, lowering his voice. "See here, Creed. I've known you some years now. Reckon that's why I rode all the way up here, to warn you proper." He glanced toward the doorway. "People are saying things. Bad things about that woman you took in." Matteo's cup settled hard against the table. "Speak plain or don't speak at all." "They're calling her a witch wife," Holt continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Say she brings death wherever she goes. 3 families she worked for back east, all dead within months. Fever, they say, or worse." He paused, fingers drumming nervously on his cup. "And now there's word from Kansas. Her own family." A sharp intake of breath from the doorway cut him off. Mary Ellen stood there, her face as white as the sheets she'd been hanging. Her hands clutched a basket of laundry so tightly her knuckles showed pale. Matteo's fist slammed against the table, making both cups jump. "I won't have lies spread under my roof, deputy." His voice was low, but carried the rumble of distant thunder. "Not by you nor anyone else." Deputy Holt stood quickly, settling his hat back on his head. "Meant no offense, Creed. Just thought you ought to know what's being said." He moved toward the door, giving Mary Ellen a wide berth as if she carried visible contagion. "I'll leave the supplies on your porch." They listened to him mount up and ride away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the forest quiet. Mary Ellen hadn't moved from the doorway, the laundry basket trembling in her grip. Without a word, she set it down and fled to her curtained bunk, drawing the fabric closed behind her. Matteo stood at the window, watching the sun's slow descent behind the mountains. The cabin filled with long shadows before he finally approached the curtain. "Mary Ellen," he said softly, "reckon we need to talk about what the deputy said." A muffled sob came from behind the fabric. After a moment, she emerged, her face tear-stained but composed. She sat at the table, hands folded tightly in her lap. Matteo took the chair across from her, waiting. "It's true," she whispered finally. "Not the witch part, that's foolishness. But the deaths—" Her voice broke. "My father was the first. He was a preacher, strong in his faith. But the cough took him anyway. Then my mother started showing the same signs. The doctors called it hereditary consumption." She drew a shaky breath. "My little sisters followed, one by one. I nursed them all, prayed over them all, watched them all slip away." Tears rolled down her cheeks unchecked. "The families I worked for, I never meant them harm. I didn't know I might be carrying the sickness. They were kind to me, and I repaid their kindness with—" She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. "I should never have let you marry me. I've cursed you too, just like all the others." Matteo's jaw tightened as he listened, his weathered face showing the struggle between fear and compassion. The cabin had grown dark enough that the oil lamp on the table cast dancing shadows on the walls. Finally, he moved his chair closer to hers and, with visible hesitation, laid his rough hand over her trembling ones. "Ain't no curse stronger than kindness," he said quietly. His voice was gentle, though his fingers shook slightly against hers. "The Lord gives each of us our burden to bear. Carrying it alone don't make it lighter. Mary Ellen's sobs gradually quieted, though tears still traced paths down her face. "I've tried so hard to have faith," she whispered, "to believe that God has purpose in all this suffering. But sometimes—" She looked down at their joined hands. "Sometimes I'm just so tired of being afraid." Mateo didn't respond immediately. The fire popped and crackled in the hearth, and somewhere in the darkness outside, a whippoorwill began its evening song. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "After Clara died, I cursed God something fierce, figured he'd abandoned me up here in these mountains." He paused, thumb moving unconsciously across Mary Ellen's knuckles. "Took me years to see that maybe he was just waiting for me to reach out my hand again." They sat in silence as the lamp burned lower, their shadows merging on the cabin wall. Mary Ellen's breathing had steadied, though she made no move to withdraw her hands from his. The night wind whispered through the pine boughs outside, a sound like distant prayer. "What happens now?" she asked finally, her voice small in the darkness. Mateo's grip tightened slightly on her hands. "Now we face whatever comes together. That's what marriage means, proper or not." He cleared his throat. "I may not be much for praying anymore, but I reckon your faith is strong, enough for both of us for now." The lamp flickered, casting a warm glow over their joined hands, his dark and calloused from years of trapping, hers pale and worn from endless hours of nursing the sick. In that quiet moment, something shifted between them, like spring ice breaking up on a mountain stream. They weren't just two lonely people sharing space anymore. They were two souls sharing a burden, and somehow that made it feel lighter for them both. They sat there until the lamp burned so low the flame wavered, each lost in their own thoughts but anchored by that simple touch between them. The night deepened around the cabin, but inside, a different kind of darkness had begun to lift, the kind that comes from carrying secrets and sorrows alone. The storm rolled in without warning, turning the late spring afternoon dark as dusk. Thunder crashed against the mountainsides like God's own drums, while lightning split the sky into jagged pieces. Inside the cabin, Mateo added another log to the fire, as wind howled through every crack and crevice. Mary Ellen sat wrapped in a quilt by the hearth, her face flushed. The cough had started that morning, small at first, like a tickle in her throat. But as the day wore on and the storm intensified, it grew deeper, more persistent. Each time it seized her, her whole body shook with the effort. Mateo watched her from across the room, his face lined with concern. The sound of her coughing reminded him too much of Clara's final days. He'd been helpless then, watching his wife fade like morning mist. The memory sat heavy in his chest as another bout of coughing racked Mary Ellen's slight frame. "Let me fix you some tea," he said, moving to the shelf where he kept his dried herbs. His hands passed over the familiar jars until he found what he wanted. Pine needles gathered in early spring, when their medicine was strongest. He remembered Henry Two Feathers showing him how to harvest them years ago, during their time together in the war. "The pine," Henry had said, his voice steady and sure, "gives strength through the darkest seasons. It shares its medicine with those who ask properly." The Apache healer had taught Mateo many things about the mountain's remedies during their scouting days, lessons that had served him well in his solitary life. Mary Ellen tried to protest, but her words dissolved into another coughing spell. Mateo set water to boil and added a generous spoonful of honey to the mug. When the pine needle tea was ready, he helped her hold the cup steady. "Small sips," he instructed, one hand supporting her back. "Let it warm you proper." The storm raged through the night, rattling the cabin's shutters and sending cold drafts skating across the floor. Mateo kept the fire blazing, feeding it log after log until the whole room glowed orange. Still, Mary Ellen's cough persisted, each bout leaving her more drained than the last. Near midnight, he heard her whispered prayers between coughs. "Lord, give me strength. Help me bear this trial." The words caught in her throat, turning into a ragged gasp for air. Mateo's jaw clenched. He'd seen that same desperate faith in Clara's eyes, watched her pray until the fever took her voice entirely. The thought of watching another woman waste away under his roof sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the storm. Dawn brought no relief. The rain continued its assault, turning the world outside into a gray blur. Mary Ellen dozed fitfully in her bunk, while Mateo paced the cabin's length, feeling more trapped with each step. The pine needle tea helped some, but he knew it wasn't enough. She needed real medicine, the kind only Henry Two Feathers would know. By the second night, Mateo had made up his mind. As soon as the storm broke, he would ride north to the Apache camp where Henry lived with his sister Nalin. It was a good few hours' ride through rough country, but he'd made the journey before. Henry's knowledge of healing went deeper than any doctor's. It reached into the spirit itself, where sickness often took root. The rain finally eased on the morning of the third day, though heavy clouds still hung low over the mountains. Mary Ellen sat up in her bunk, trying to smooth her hair with trembling hands. Her face was pale except for two bright spots of color high on her cheeks. "I'm riding out to see Henry Two Feathers," Mateo told her, pulling on his oilskin coat. "He'll know what medicines might help." "Please don't trouble yourself," Mary Ellen protested, though her voice was barely more than a whisper. "I'll be fine here. It's just a spring chill, nothing more." But the fear in her eyes betrayed her words. They both knew this was more than a simple cold. "Won't take but a day or two," Mateo replied, already gathering supplies for the journey. He'd need food, coffee, and trade goods for Henry's people. It was their way. Nothing given without something offered in return. At his workbench, Mateo pulled out a piece of pine he'd been saving for carving. His knife moved surely through the wood, shaping it into a simple cross. He'd seen Mary Ellen touch the empty spot on her neck where a cross once hung. Lost or sold, he didn't know which. But he recognized the gesture of someone reaching for absent comfort. The cross took shape quickly under his skilled hands. It wasn't fancy work, but it carried the honest beauty of the forest in its grain. He smoothed the edges carefully, then rubbed it with beeswax until it gleamed in the dim light. Mary Ellen's eyes filled with tears when he placed it beside her bed. Her fingers traced the smooth wood reverently. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." "The Lord watches closer in these mountains than most folks reckon," Mateo said gruffly, uncomfortable with her emotion. "That's just to remind you when I'm gone." He spent the rest of the day preparing for the journey. The ground would be treacherous after so much rain, so he took extra care, checking his mule's shoes and tack. He filled Mary Ellen's wood box to overflowing and left enough ready-cooked food to last several days. "There's pine needle tea already mixed in that blue jar," he told her, pointing to the shelf. "Honey's right beside it. Keep the fire strong and don't go fetching water if you're feeling weak." He paused, looking around the cabin for anything else she might need. "I'll manage," Mary Ellen assured him, though another cough undermined her confident tone. "I've looked after myself before." Mateo nodded, but his chest tightened at the thought of leaving her alone. She looked so small in the big cabin, wrapped in her quilt by the fire. The wooden cross caught the firelight from its place beside her bed, throwing long shadows on the wall. He slept poorly that night, listening to her cough in the darkness. By first light, He was already saddling his mule. The morning air was sharp with the aftermath of rain, and mist clung to the trees like ghost shapes in the dawn. Mary Ellen stood in the doorway, the quilt pulled tight around her shoulders. "Be careful," she said softly. "The trails will be dangerous after the storm." "I've ridden worse," Mateo replied, checking his saddlebags one final time. He'd packed dried meat, coffee, and several prime beaver pelts to trade. "Keep that door bolted at night. Ain't likely anyone'll come by, but better safe." She nodded, then covered her mouth as another cough shook her. The sound seemed to echo across the quiet mountain morning, and Mateo's resolve strengthened. He wouldn't lose another woman to sickness, not if there was anything in his power to prevent it. The mule picked its way carefully through the wet woods, hooves sliding occasionally on slick pine needles. Mateo let the animal choose its path, trusting its sure-footedness more than his own judgment on the treacherous ground. His thoughts stayed with the cabin behind him, where a lonely woman fought for breath beside a newly carved cross. The forest gradually came alive around him as the sun rose higher. Birds called from the dripping branches, and once a startled deer crashed away through the underbrush. But Mateo barely noticed. His mind was already at the Apache camp, rehearsing how he would explain things to Henry Two Feathers. The old scout had been more than just a fellow soldier during the war. He'd become a friend and teacher, showing Mateo how to read the mountain's moods and heal its hurts. Henry's knowledge of medicine went beyond simple herbs and poultices. He understood the way spirit and body worked together, how one could strengthen or weaken the other. Mateo remembered Henry's words about healing. Medicine is not just in the plant or the prayer, but in the space between them. That is where the real power lives. At the time, Mateo hadn't fully understood, but watching Mary Ellen's fierce faith war with her failing body, he thought he was beginning to grasp Henry's meaning. The trail wound higher into the mountains, following an old game path that would eventually lead to the Apache camp. The going was slow with all the mud, but Mateo pressed on steadily. Every minute counted now. He could almost hear Mary Ellen's cough echoing through the trees, spurring him forward like a spur in his heart. The wooden cross he'd carved seemed to weigh in his thoughts as he rode. It was such a simple thing, just two pieces of pine joined together. But he'd put something of himself into the making of it, something beyond mere craftsmanship. Perhaps that was what Henry meant about the space between things, where real power lived. Mateo touched the brim of his hat, sending a shower of water drops to the ground. Above him, the clouds were finally beginning to break, showing patches of blue sky like promises of better days ahead. He whispered a prayer of his own, rough and unpracticed, but sincere as the wood grain in that simple cross. "Lord, if you're listening up here in these mountains, help me find the right medicine for her. She's got faith enough for both of us. Don't let that faith go unrewarded." The mule plodded on through the wet woods, carrying him steadily northward toward help and hope. The moon hung high over the mountain peaks when Mateo finally spotted the Apache camp. Small fires dotted the clearing like earthbound stars, their smoke rising straight up in the still night air. His mule's hooves crunched softly on pine needles as they approached. A figure emerged from the shadows, rifle balanced carefully, but not aimed. "Who comes at night?" The familiar voice carried both welcome and warning. "Henry," Mateo called softly. "It's Mateo Creed." Henry Two Feathers stepped into the moonlight, his weathered face breaking into a smile. He wore a mix of traditional clothes and cavalry cast-offs, testament to his life bridging two worlds. "Brother," he said warmly, lowering his rifle, "the night brings you far from your cabin." They clasped hands in the darkness, and Henry's grip was strong and steady as ever. The years since their scouting days hadn't weakened that iron strength, though silver now threaded his black hair. "Come," Henry said, leading Matteo to a small fire set apart from the others. "Share my coffee and tell me what troubles your spirit. I see it in your eyes. Something heavy weighs on you." Matteo dismounted stiffly, his bones aching from the long ride. He loosened the mule's cinch while Henry stirred the fire and set a battered coffee pot in the coals. The familiar routine of camp settled over them both. When they were finally seated with steaming cups, Henry waited patiently. The silence stretched comfortable between them, broken only by the pop and hiss of burning pine. "I took a wife," Matteo said at last, staring into his coffee. Henry's eyebrows rose slightly. "The mountain man returns to the world of men? This is news indeed." His tone was gentle, knowing how Matteo had withdrawn after losing Clara. Matteo told him everything. The scene in Henry Hollow, the townsfolk's cruelty, Mary Ellen's gentle spirit and failing health. The words poured out of him like spring melt, while Henry listened without interruption. "They called her cursed," Matteo finished bitterly. "Said she brought death, but all I see is a woman with more faith than that whole town combined." Henry nodded slowly. "Fear makes men cruel. They see death touch a family and think it spreads like fire. But they forget. Death comes to all families in time. It is not curse, but nature." He paused, studying Matteo's face. "You care for this woman." It wasn't a question, but Matteo answered anyway. She deserved better than their hatred. No one should die alone and scorned. "Ah." Henry's dark eyes glinted in the firelight. "So you married her to save her from loneliness, but now you fear you cannot save her from death." Matteo's hands tightened around his cup. "The consumption's in her blood," she says. "Took her whole family. I've been giving her pine needle tea, but the cough gets worse." Henry rose and disappeared into his lodge, returning with several leather pouches. "Medicine I can give you?" he said, setting them down carefully. "Bearberry leaf to ease the chest, spruce gum for strength, sage to purify." He opened each pouch, showing Matteo how to prepare the remedies. "But understand," Henry continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of teaching, "these plants are only part of healing. The body knows sickness, yes, but the spirit knows it too. Fear can kill faster than fever." He poured more coffee as he spoke. "Your Mary Ellen, she fears death less than loneliness. You have already given her strongest medicine by showing her she is not alone. Love heals fear better than any herb I know." Matteo absorbed this in silence, watching the fire paint shadows across Henry's weathered face. Finally, he asked, "Will she live?" "That is not for me to say, but I will tell you this. Clean mountain air and a peaceful heart can work miracles that doctor's medicine cannot explain. Let her find joy in small things. Let her see beauty in each sunrise. Most important, let her know she is loved." Henry smiled slightly. "Even a gruff mountain man's love is better than none." They talked through the night, Henry sharing more of his healing wisdom while Matteo listened intently. As dawn began to pale the eastern sky, Henry helped him pack the precious medicines. "Remember," Henry said as Matteo mounted up, "healing walks on two legs, medicine and faith. One without the other will always stumble." Matteo nodded gratefully. "Much obliged, brother. I won't forget." The morning sun was well up when Matteo reached the river trail leading home. His mind was full of Henry's teachings, already planning how to use the medicines. The mule picked its way carefully along the muddy path. A sound stopped them both, a child's cry, thin and frightened, barely audible over the river's rush. Matteo reined in, listening hard. There it came, again, from downstream. He found the overturned wagon half submerged in the shallows. The scene told its story clearly. The team had tried to ford at the wrong spot, the current had caught them, and the wagon had tipped. 2 bodies lay covered by canvas on the bank, already stiff with death. Fever, by the look of their faces. The crying led him to a small cave in the riverbank. A boy huddled there, no more than 8 years old, soaked and shivering. His freckled face was streaked with tears and mud. "Easy there, son," Mateo said softly, crouching down. "I won't hurt you." The boy's teeth chattered as he spoke. "Mama and Papa wouldn't wake up. The water was so cold." Mateo's heart clenched. He shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around the boy's thin shoulders. "What's your name, lad?" "Tommy," the child stammered. "Well, Tommy, I reckon you've been real brave. But you don't have to be brave alone anymore." Mateo kept his voice gentle, the way he'd talk to a spooked colt. "I've got a warm cabin not far from here. Would you like to come get dried out?" Tommy looked at the covered bodies, then back at Mateo with eyes too old for his young face. "They're really gone, aren't they?" "Yes, son. I'm powerful sorry about that." Mateo squeezed the boy's shoulder. "But you're still here, and I aim to make sure you stay that way." The decision wasn't really a decision at all. Mateo couldn't leave the child here, and something in the boy's quiet courage reminded him of his own losses. After saying a brief prayer over Tommy's parents, Mateo lifted him onto the mule. They rode double toward home, the medicine pouches and the orphan boy both unexpected gifts from this journey. Tommy gradually stopped shivering and began to talk a little, telling Mateo how they'd been heading to California when fever took his parents. "My wife, Mary Ellen, will be glad to meet you," Mateo said as they topped the last rise before his cabin. "She's got a kind heart, and she makes the best biscuits this side of the mountains." He felt Tommy relax slightly against him at these simple, homely words. Looking down at the cabin, smoke rising straight from its chimney into the clear mountain air, Mateo thought about Henry's words regarding love and healing. Perhaps Tommy's arrival was no accident. Maybe the boy needed healing as much as Mary Ellen, and maybe they could help heal each other. The sun broke through the clouds as they started down the trail, warming Mateo's back and casting their joined shadow ahead of them. A shadow that looked, he realized with a start, like a father and son riding home together. The sun hung low on the horizon as Mateo guided his mule up the final stretch of trail to the cabin. Tommy had fallen quiet, his small frame leaning heavily against Mateo's chest. The boy's exhaustion was plain after their long ride, but at least he'd stopped shivering. Smoke curled from the chimney in lazy wisps, and the sight of it made Mateo's heart lift. He hadn't realized until that moment how much he'd come to think of this place as home, not just his shelter, but theirs. "Mary Ellen," he called out as they approached. "Got someone here needs looking after." The cabin door creaked open, and Mary Ellen stepped onto the porch. Her face was pale in the fading light, but her smile was warm as summer. She took in the sight of the bedraggled boy with a quick intake of breath. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, hurrying down the steps. Her own illness seemed forgotten as she reached for Tommy. "You must be half frozen. Come inside where it's warm." Tommy looked uncertainly at Mateo, who nodded encouragement. "Go on, son. Mary Ellen's got a way of making folks feel right at home." Mary Ellen led Tommy inside while Mateo tended to the mule. By the time he'd finished in the stable and carried in Henry's medicine pouches, she had the boy settled by the fire. She knelt beside him, gently washing the mud and tears from his hands with water she'd warmed on the hearth. "Such brave hands," she murmured, her voice soft as she worked. "They've been through so much today." Almost without thinking, she began to hum a lullaby, an old hymn that spoke of peace and rest. Mateo paused in the doorway, struck by the tableau before him. The firelight caught Mary Ellen's hair like a halo as she cared for the orphaned child. Despite her own weakness, she showed nothing but strength and tenderness. Her humming filled the cabin with a gentle grace he hadn't known was missing. He set about preparing Henry's medicines, following the careful instructions he'd been given. The familiar scents of bearberry leaf and sage mixed with the spruce gum as he brewed the tea. When it was ready, he brought a cup to Mary Ellen. "Henry Two Feathers sent this," he said quietly. "Says it'll help ease your breathing." She accepted the cup with grateful hands. "Your friend is very kind." She sipped carefully, and Mateo watched as some of the tension left her shoulders. Her next breath came easier, without the catch that had worried him these past weeks. Tommy's eyes were growing heavy, but he watched them both with the wariness of a child who'd lost too much. Can I stay?" he asked in a small voice. "Of course you can stay," Mary Ellen answered before Mateo could speak. She smoothed Tommy's damp hair back from his forehead. "This is your home now, if you want it to be." Mateo nodded his agreement, his throat tight with unexpected emotion. "We've got that extra bunk. Been waiting for just the right person to fill it, I reckon." That night, they made up the small bunk with fresh linens Mary Ellen had sewn. Tommy fell asleep to the sound of her humming, his breathing deep and even. Mateo and Mary Ellen sat by the fire, speaking in low voices about the changes this day had brought. "The roof needs patching before the next rain," Mateo said. "Might be good to teach the boy some useful work, keep his mind occupied." "Yes," Mary Ellen agreed. "And I can show him how to tend the vegetable patch. Children need purpose, especially after loss." She paused, then added softly, "We all do." The next morning dawned clear and bright. After a breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of the molasses, Mateo took Tommy up to the roof. The boy proved eager to learn, handing up shingles and watching carefully as Mateo showed him how to lay them properly. "My pa never taught me things like this," Tommy said as they worked. "He was always too busy planning for California." "Well," Mateo replied, "reckon there's all kinds of things worth knowing right here in Colorado. Proper roof over your head's one of them." Below, they could hear Mary Ellen singing as she worked in her garden. Her voice was stronger today, the herbal tea already showing its worth. She called them down at midday with fresh biscuits, and they ate in the sunshine, all three together. The days began to fall into a rhythm. Mornings were for chores. Tommy learned to feed the mule, gather eggs from the few chickens they kept, and help Mary Ellen with her endless tasks. She taught him to recognize the different vegetables sprouting in her garden and showed him how to pull weeds without disturbing the tender plants. In the afternoons, Mateo would take the boy along as he checked his nearest trap lines, teaching him the ways of the forest. Tommy soaked up the knowledge like dry earth in spring rain, asking questions about everything from animal tracks to weather signs. The evenings became something sacred. After supper, Mateo would take out the worn Bible that had belonged to his first wife. He'd never been much for reading aloud, but Mary Ellen's quiet encouragement gave him confidence. His deep voice would fill the cabin with ancient words of hope and redemption, while she joined in on the passages she knew by heart. Tommy listened with wide eyes, sometimes asking questions that made them both think carefully about their answers. His natural curiosity seemed to bridge the gap between Mateo's cautious faith and Mary Ellen's deeper devotion. "Why did God let my mama and papa die?" he asked one evening, his voice small but steady. Mary Ellen drew him close while Mateo considered his response. "Sometimes," Mateo said finally, "the Lord's ways ain't for us to understand, but he makes sure we're not alone in our grief, gives us new family when we need it most." A week passed, then another. The cabin transformed with Tommy's presence. His toy soldiers, carved by Matteo in the evenings, stood guard on windowsills. His drawings, made with charcoal on scraps of paper Mary Ellen saved, decorated the walls. His laughter, hesitant at first but growing stronger, joined Mary Ellen's songs and Matteo's deep chuckles around the supper table. The change in Mary Ellen was remarkable. Though still thin and often tired, her eyes shone with new purpose. Having Tommy to care for seemed to give her strength she didn't know she possessed. The herbal remedies from Aus Henry helped, but Matteo suspected it was love that was the real medicine. One evening, as they sat around the table sharing a rabbit stew, Tommy accidentally knocked over his cup of milk. He froze, terror flashing across his face, the fear of a child expecting punishment. But before either adult could react, he straightened his shoulders and said, "I'm sorry. I'll clean it up." Mary Ellen handed him a cloth, her smile gentle. "Accidents happen, dear heart. That's what family's for, helping each other through the spills and stumbles." Matteo watched as Tommy carefully wiped up the milk, his small face serious with concentration. The boy had brought something essential to their home, something beyond the simple presence of a child. He'd brought hope, hope that life could begin again, that love could heal the deepest wounds, that family could be found in the most unexpected places. Later that night, after Tommy was asleep, Matteo found Mary Ellen standing by the window. The moon cast enough light to see tears on her cheeks, but when she turned to him, she was smiling. "I never thought I'd have this," she whispered. "A home, a family, someone to mother." Matteo took her hand, marveling at how natural it felt now. "Reckon the Lord knows what he's about sometimes, bringing the right people together when they need each other most." Her fingers tightened around his. "The tea Henry sent. It helps more than any doctor's medicine ever did. But it's this." She gestured to encompass the cabin, Tommy's sleeping form, their joined hands. "This is what truly heals." The cabin settled around them, creaking softly in the night wind. From Tommy's bunk came the peaceful breathing of a child at rest. Outside, a whippoorwill called, and somewhere far off, a coyote answered. But inside, in this space they'd made together, there was only warmth and peace and the quiet certainty that they had found something precious. A family built not from blood, but from love and choice and the grace of second chances. The morning sun painted golden stripes across the cabin floor as Mary Ellen set fresh wildflowers in a tin can on the table. Tommy had gathered them himself, proud of his eye for color. June had settled over the mountains, bringing warm breezes that carried the scent of pine and fresh grass through the open door. Matteo was outside splitting wood when he heard horses approaching. His hand moved instinctively toward his rifle before he recognized Preacher Garrison's wagon coming up the trail, followed by 2 women on horseback. He set down his axe and brushed sawdust from his shirt. "Mary Ellen?" he called softly through the door. "We've got company coming." She appeared beside him, one hand pressed to her chest. Tommy peeked around her skirts, curious but cautious. The wagon creaked to a stop in the yard, and Preacher Garrison climbed down, his movements hesitant. The women, Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Miller from the Church Society, sat straighter in their saddles, clutching bundles wrapped in cloth. "Mr. Creed," the preacher began, removing his hat. "Mrs. Creed, we've come with purpose today." His voice wavered slightly as he reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. Mary Ellen's fingers found Matteo's arm, gripping tight. The preacher approached slowly, like a man crossing thin ice. "This here's from the church council," he said, extending the letter, "and from my own heart as well." Matteo took the envelope but didn't open it. That's quite a ride just to deliver a letter, preacher. Mrs. Peterson dismounted, her face soft with something like shame. We brought more than just words, Mary Ellen. Some blankets we quilted, and preserves, if you'll accept them. Word reached us about the orphan boy, Mrs. Miller added, climbing down with her bundle. About how you've cared for him, made us remember what Christian charity truly means. Tommy stepped forward then, his chin up. Her name's Miss Mary Ellen, he said clearly, and she's the kindest lady in all Colorado Territory. A smile tugged at Mateo's mouth. The boy had grown protective of them both, but especially of Mary Ellen. The women exchanged glances, their eyes growing wet. Indeed she is, Preacher Garrison agreed softly, which makes our past behavior all the more shameful. He cleared his throat. We've come to ask forgiveness and to worship together, if you'll permit it, out here under God's own roof. Mary Ellen's grip on Mateo's arm loosened. He could feel her trembling, but when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. There's fresh coffee on the stove, she said, and I believe I hear his voice in these pine boughs as clear as any church bell. The morning transformed into something holy. They arranged logs in a rough circle in the yard where sunshine filtered through the towering pines. Mary Ellen's hymn book, worn but treasured, provided the words they all knew by heart. Her voice, stronger now after weeks of Henry's herbal teas, rose sweet and true above the others. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The familiar words floated up through the branches while chickadees darted overhead. Tommy sat close to Mary Ellen, his small voice joining in when he knew the words. Mateo stood slightly apart, watching his wife's face glow with joy she couldn't quite contain. Preacher Garrison read from his Bible, the Sermon of the Prodigal Son, and spoke of forgiveness flowing both ways. His voice cracked when he looked at Mary Ellen. Sometimes those of us meant to shepherd the flock are the ones most in need of grace. The letter, when they finally read it, was simple but sincere. The church council expressed deep regret for their treatment of Mary Ellen, acknowledging that fear had led them to forget Christ's teaching of love and mercy. They asked her to accept their apology and offered to welcome her whenever she felt strong enough to visit town. Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Miller unpacked their gifts. 3 beautiful quilts pieced in star patterns, jars of strawberry preserves, dried apples, and a small bag of hard candies that made Tommy's eyes shine. But more precious than the gifts was the healing their presence represented. After the worship, they shared coffee and Mary Ellen's cornbread, talking easily about spring plantings and the weather. The women admired her neat cabin and the flourishing vegetable garden. They caught up on town news, but gently now, with care for her feelings. "We miss your sewing something fierce," Mrs. Miller admitted. "Nobody has your touch with fine stitching." "Though we understand if you never want to," Mrs. Peterson began, but Mary Ellen shook her head. "The work was never what hurt," she said softly. "Only the loneliness." When the visitors finally departed, the afternoon sun had begun its westward slide. They left behind more than their gifts. They had brought a bridge back to the world beyond the cabin, built of humility and hope. Mateo watched them disappear down the trail, then turned to find Mary Ellen wiping tears from her cheeks. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I feel lighter, like I can breathe deeper." She straightened her shoulders as if testing this theory. "Would you walk with me a bit, while the sun's still warm?" He offered his arm, and they strolled together through the meadow beside the cabin. Wildflowers nodded in the breeze, Indian paintbrush burning red against the grass, blue lupines reaching skyward, tiny white daisies scattered like stars. Tommy ran ahead, chasing butterflies and calling out the flower names Mary Ellen had taught him. "I used to dream, you know," she said after a while, her steps slow but steady. "Back in Kansas, before everyone got sick. I wanted to open a home for orphan girls, teach them to sew and make their way in the world." She paused, watching Tommy crouch to examine a particularly bright flower. "I thought that dream died with my family." Mateo considered her words, thinking of the way she'd taken to Tommy, how her gentle teaching had helped heal his grief. "Dreams don't die," he said finally. "Sometimes they just need replanting in different soil." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with possibility. "What do you mean?" "Been thinking we could add on to the cabin, build you a proper sewing room with big windows for light and air. Plenty of children out here need mothering and learning both." Mary Ellen's breath caught, but not from sickness this time. "You do that?" "Got the trees right here," he said, gesturing to the forest. "And 2 strong backs now. Tommy's getting mighty handy with tools." He squeezed her hand. "Your dreams matter, Mary Ellen. To me, and to whoever needs them." Thunder rumbled in the distance as they made their way back to the cabin. The air had grown heavy with the promise of rain, but Mary Ellen's step was lighter than he'd ever seen it. Inside, they worked together to prepare supper, cornbread and beans with the last of the morning's bacon. Tommy set the table without being asked, carefully placing the wildflowers he'd gathered in the center. When Mary Ellen reached for one of the new quilts to wrap around her shoulders against the coming storm's chill, her smile carried no shadow of past pain. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she said softly as they sat down to eat. Who would have thought that morning in town, when everything seemed darkest? She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Mateo reached for her hand across the table. "Reckon sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air." Thunder crashed closer now, but inside their cabin all was warm and bright. Tommy looked between them, secure in his place at their table. "Miss Mary Ellen," he said around a mouthful of cornbread, "will you teach me that hymn again? The one about amazing grace?" "After supper," she promised, and her laugh rang free and clear as the coming rain began to fall. Outside, the storm gathered strength, but it held no terror now. Inside the cabin, they had built something stronger than fear, a family forged in grace, a love that could weather any darkness. Mary Ellen's redemption had begun not in grand gestures, but in simple acts of faith, a boy's trust, a community's humility, a husband's quiet support. The thunder rolled again, and they drew closer together, sharing cornbread and laughter as the rain drummed its rhythm on their sturdy roof. The crack of Mateo's axe echoed through the pines as he worked from sunrise to sunset. Each swing brought down another tree, each log another piece of Mary Ellen's dream taking shape. The summer air filled with the sweet scent of fresh-cut pine and honest sweat. Tommy proved himself an eager helper, his small boots leaving tracks in the sawdust as he scampered between the worksite and the tool bench. "Like this, Pa?" he'd ask, holding up each sanded board for inspection. The word "Pa" had slipped out natural as breathing one morning, and neither of them mentioned it, but Mateo's eyes had grown suspiciously damp. "That's fine work, son," Mateo would say, running his calloused hand over the smooth surface. "Reckon your ma will be right pleased with this one." Mary Ellen watched from the doorway when she could, wrapped in one of the church lady's quilts against the morning chill. Her cough had eased considerably with the warmer weather and Henry's medicines, though she still tired easily. But her eyes shone with anticipation as the walls began to rise. "Lord above, Mateo," she breathed one evening, watching him fit another beam into place. "I never expected anything so grand." He just nodded, already planning the next day's work. The abandoned mine shack 2 miles north had yielded a treasure. 4 large window panes, dusty but unbroken. He'd wrapped them carefully in burlap and brought them home in the wagon, padding each precious piece with pine boughs. "Ain't proper sewing without proper light," he'd said simply. The work took a full week of dawn to dusk labor. Tommy learned to measure twice and cut once, to drive nails straight and true, to mix the mud that would seal the logs. His small hands grew stronger, his aim with the hammer more sure. Mary Ellen kept them fed with hearty stews and fresh bread, her strength growing alongside the new room. When the last window was set and the final board sanded smooth, they stood together in the doorway. Sunshine poured through the glass, painting golden squares on the plank floor. The room stretched 12 feet by 10 feet, with windows facing east and south to catch both morning and afternoon light. Shelves lined the north wall, waiting for fabric and thread. The whole space smelled of fresh wood and possibility. Mary Ellen stepped inside, her fingers trailing along the smooth windowsill. "It's like standing in a piece of heaven," she whispered. Tears sparkled in her eyes as she turned to Mateo. "How can I ever thank you enough?" He shuffled his feet, uncomfortable with praise. "Ain't nothing but boards and nails, woman." But they all knew it was more than that. It was a promise kept, a dream given wings, a future built by loving hands. The next day, Mary Ellen moved her sewing table beneath the eastern window. Her old treadle machine, carefully oiled and polished, caught the morning light like a jewel. She hung white muslin curtains, light enough to let the sunshine through but offering privacy when needed. Bundles of Henry's healing herbs, sage, yarrow, and bearberry, dried from rafters, filling the air with their clean, wild scent. Word spread through Henry Hollow about the new sewing room. Within days, the first package arrived. A bundle of calico scraps from Mrs. Miller, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. A note tucked inside read, "For whatever good use you might find." More followed. Buttons from the mercantile owner's wife, spools of thread from the minister's daughter, even a box of delicate lace trim from a lady in Denver who'd heard the story. Mary Ellen's fingers flew over the fabrics, piecing together quilts and small garments. Her hymns filled the sunlit space as she worked. "Sweet hour of prayer, what a friend we have in Jesus, Rock of Ages." Tommy would often sit at her feet, sorting buttons or winding thread, adding his clear child's voice to the familiar tunes. One afternoon, as Mary Ellen was cutting patterns for a child's dress, shadows darkened her doorway. She looked up to find Henry Two Feathers standing there, his dignified presence filling the room. Beside him stood a woman Mary Ellen had never met, but whose bearing marked her as Henry's kin. "Mary Ellen," Henry said with a small bow, "I bring my sister, Nayland Two Feathers. She has skill with needle and thread, as you do." Nayland stepped forward, her dark eyes taking in the sun-filled room. She carried herself with quiet pride, though grief had left its marks on her face. "My husband walked to the spirit world this past winter," she said softly. "Pneumonia took him after we were moved from our ancestral lands." Mary Ellen's heart ached with recognition of that loss. "Please," she said, gesturing to the second chair she kept ready for visitors. "Sit with me a while." Nayland settled beside her, and Mary Ellen saw her fingers move instinctively toward the fabric on the table. "Such bright colors," she said. "They remind me of sunset on the mountains." "Would you like to help me make something beautiful from them?" Mary Ellen asked. A small smile touched Nayland's lips. "Our people have always spoken with our hands," she said, "through beads and quills and weaving, perhaps now through cloth as well." Henry nodded approvingly. "I will return at sunset," he told his sister. "Share what wisdom you both carry." The afternoon passed in peaceful industry. Nalin's skilled fingers moved surely through the unfamiliar medium, adding her own patterns to Mary Ellen's traditional designs. They spoke little at first, letting their work build trust between them, but gradually stories began to flow. Nalin spoke of her people's children, how they needed warm blankets for the coming winter. Mary Ellen shared her dream of helping orphans find comfort and skills for their future. Together, they began planning quilts that would bridge their two worlds. Star patterns worked in earth tones, traditional blocks incorporating mountain symbols. "These will tell stories," Nalin said, holding up a completed square. "Stories of hope growing from sorrow, of hands reaching across old fears." Mary Ellen touched the fabric reverently, like a prayer sewn in cloth. By the time Henry returned, the women had completed their first joint project, a small quilt featuring both colonial stars and Apache morning sun designs. More importantly, they had formed a bond that transcended their different backgrounds, founded on shared loss and the healing power of creation. "You will come again?" Mary Ellen asked as they prepared to leave. Nalin's smile was warmer now. "Tomorrow, if I may. There are many children who need warm blankets and many stories yet to tell." That evening, as the family sat down to supper, Mary Ellen looked around at her unlikely blessings: Mateo's strong, quiet presence, Tommy's bright chatter, the new friendship with Nalin, and the sun-filled room that had made it all possible. "The Lord does provide," she said softly, squeezing Mateo's hand. He squeezed back, watching the last rays of sunset paint her face with golden light through those carefully installed windows. The cabin had become more than shelter now. It was truly a sanctuary, where hope grew as steady as the herbs hanging from the rafters, and love wrapped around them all like the quilts they created together. Tommy helped clear the dishes, then returned to the sewing room to arrange his collection of smooth stones along the windowsill. "For pretty," he explained when Mateo raised an eyebrow, "like Miss Nalin's beadwork." The evening settled around them soft as a well-worn quilt, full of the peace that comes from shared purpose and answered prayers. Through the new windows, they could see the first stars appearing, bright as hope against the darkening sky. The aspens had turned golden, their leaves whispering autumn's arrival in the high country. Mateo sat on his cabin's front step, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in amber and rose. These past months with Mary Ellen had changed everything: the cabin, the land, his heart. Her gentle presence had transformed his solitary refuge into something he'd never expected to find again. A home. He thought of how she moved through their days, her strength growing despite her illness. The way she taught Tommy his letters in the evenings, patient and kind. How her hymns drifted through the glass room while she sewed, lifting everyone's spirits. Even her coughing spells seemed less frequent now, eased by Henry's medicines and the clean mountain air. The realization had come to him gradually, like dawn breaking over the peaks. He loved her, not just as a protector or friend, but with a depth that both thrilled and terrified him. After losing Clara, he'd sworn never to risk his heart again. But Mary Ellen had slipped past his defenses with her quiet courage and unfailing faith. That morning, he saddled his horse and rode north to find Henry Two Feathers. The medicine man was tending his herb garden when Mateo arrived, carefully harvesting the last of summer's bounty before frost could claim it. "Brother," Henry greeted him, straightening from his work. "Your face speaks of important matters." Mateo dismounted, leading his horse to the hitching post. Need your counsel, Henry." They sat together by Henry's morning fire, sharing coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. The silence between them was comfortable, born of years of friendship and shared trials. Finally, Matteo spoke. "I want to marry Mary Ellen proper, in the church, before God and witnesses." He stared into his cup. "Reckon some might call me fool, taking a sick woman as true wife." Henry's dark eyes held wisdom earned through decades of watching both settlers and his own people struggle with life's hardest choices. "A man who fears no sickness shows true strength," he said simply. "Love that faces death without flinching. That is medicine stronger than any herb I gather." Relief washed through Matteo. Henry's approval meant more to him than he'd realized. "You'll come to the wedding?" "I will stand as your brother," Henry promised, "and bring medicines to keep her strong through winter." They spoke a while longer, planning how to help Mary Ellen through the coming cold months. When Matteo mounted up to leave, Henry pressed a small bundle of sage into his hand. "For cleansing the spirit before new beginnings," he explained. The ride to Henry Hollow took most of the morning. The town had changed since spring. New buildings rising, more families settling in. Matteo tied, his horse outside the small church, and took a deep breath before knocking on the parsonage door. Preacher Garrison opened it, surprise flickering across his face. "Matteo Creed, we don't often see you in town these days." "Come about Mary Ellen," Matteo said. "Want to marry her proper, in your church?" The preacher's expression softened. Come in." He ushered Matteo into his study, clearing books from a chair. "How is she faring?" "Better than spring. Henry Two Feathers' medicines help some, but mainly it's her spirit that keeps her strong." Matteo settled awkwardly in the offered seat. "She deserves a real wedding, preacher, not just that rushed business in the rain." Garrison nodded slowly. "I've regretted my part in that day's cruelty. The town has much to atone for." He smiled. "A proper wedding would be a fine start. When were you thinking?" "Before first snow, if possible, while she's still strong enough to enjoy it." Word spread quickly through Henry Hollow. Where once there had been whispers of curse and contagion, now women gathered to plan flowers and food. The mercantile owner's wife promised her best tablecloths. The baker offered a 3-tier wedding cake. Even the mining company manager's daughter volunteered to play hymns on the church's small pump organ. Matteo rode home with his saddlebags full of offerings, white ribbon, fine tea, a jar of preserved peaches. The sun was setting as he approached the cabin, painting the new glass room in shades of amber. Through the windows, he could see Mary Ellen at her sewing table, Tommy sitting at her feet with a book. She looked up as he entered, her smile warming him better than any fire. "You were gone all day," she said. "I worried something might be wrong with the trap lines." "Nothing wrong." He set his saddlebags down carefully. "Been to town, to see the preacher." Her hands stilled on her work. "The preacher?" Matteo crossed to her table, suddenly nervous as a boy. "Thought maybe, if you're willing, we might do this proper. Have a real wedding in the church, with flowers and music and such." Mary Ellen's eyes filled with tears. "But we're already married." "That was just words said quick in the rain. You deserve better." He took her hand, rough fingers gentle against her slim ones. "I love you, Mary Ellen. Want to stand before God and everyone and promise to be your husband, true and proper." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Even knowing I might not have many years?" "Every day with you is a blessing I never thought to have again." He squeezed her hand. "Will you marry me, Mary Ellen? Again? And right this time?" She pressed her free hand to her heart. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes." Tommy, who had been watching wide-eyed from his place on the floor, jumped up with a whoop. A wedding? Will there be cake? Mary Ellen laughed, the sound bright as silver bells. There usually is at weddings. The next weeks passed in a whirl of preparation. Mary Ellen spent hours in her glass room, sewing her wedding dress from fine white muslin donated by the mercantile. She worked slowly, carefully, putting all her skill into every stitch. Sometimes Nayland Two Feathers joined her, adding delicate beadwork to the bodice in traditional Apache patterns of blessing. The dress took shape like a dream becoming real, simple but elegant, with tiny tucks and gathers that caught the light. Mary Ellen tried it on one evening after supper, twirling slowly in the lamplight. "You look like an angel," Tommy declared. Mateo couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. She glowed with a joy that transformed her entire being. She caught him staring and blushed. "You'll need a proper shave before the ceremony," she teased. "Can't have my groom looking like a wild mountain man." He rubbed his beard in mock offense. "Thought you liked my wild ways." "I like everything about you." She crossed to where he sat and touched his cheek gently. "But I want everyone to see how handsome my husband is when we say our vows." They all laughed together, the cabin warm and bright against the growing autumn chill. Outside, the wind whispered through golden aspen leaves, carrying the first hint of winter's approach. But inside was all warmth and joy and the promise of love stronger than any storm. Tommy helped Mary Ellen lay out her wedding finery. The dress, a pair of soft leather shoes Nalin had made, the white ribbon for her hair. "Will I have to wear a tie?" he asked dubiously. "You'll look very fine in it," Mary Ellen assured him, "like a proper young gentleman." Later, after Tommy was asleep in his bed, Mateo and Mary Ellen sat by the fire. She leaned against his shoulder, humming softly, one of her endless store of hymns that had become the soundtrack of their lives together. "Never thought I'd have this again," Mateo said quietly. "After Clara, figured I was done with loving." Mary Ellen's hand found his. "God has his own plans, doesn't he? Even when we think our hearts are closed forever." "Reckon he does at that." Mateo kissed her hair softly. "Thank you for teaching me to trust again." Outside, the wind sang through the pines, bringing the first chill breath of fall. But inside their cabin, love burned warm and bright as the banked fire, promising to see them through whatever seasons lay ahead. The morning air hung heavy with mountain mist as Deputy Holt's horse picked its way up the narrow trail to Mateo's cabin. The clop of hooves on stone brought Tommy running to the window of the glass room, where Mary Ellen sat teaching him his letters. "Rider coming," Tommy announced, pressing his nose to the pane. "It's that deputy from town." Mary Ellen's fingers tightened on her sewing. She had been working on the last details of her wedding dress, adding tiny pearl buttons along the cuffs. Now she set it aside carefully, smoothing the fabric with trembling hands. Mateo emerged from the barn, wiping sawdust from his hands. He had been building a new shelf for Mary Ellen's growing collection of medicines and dried herbs. The sight of Deputy Holt made his jaw tighten. "Creed," Holt called out, dismounting with a grunt. His badge caught the weak sunlight. "Need a word." "Say your piece." Mateo didn't move closer, keeping himself between the deputy and the cabin door. Holt glanced at the windows, lowering his voice. "Trouble brewing in town. 2 miners down with fever at the boarding house. Folk are talking again." "Folks always talk." Mateo crossed his arms. "Don't make it true." These men worked the lucky strike, where Mary Ellen's pa preached before the sickness took him. Holt shifted uncomfortably. "Some are saying she cursed the valley, that her blood carries death." Inside the cabin, Mary Ellen's sharp intake of breath was audible through the open window. Tommy pressed closer to her side, his small face fierce with protective anger. "That's devil's talk," Mateo growled. "And you know it." "I'm just bringing warning," Holt insisted. "There's them that say the wedding should be stopped, for the safety of—" "Get off my land." Mateo's voice was deadly quiet. "You tell those miners that if they want to stop my wedding, they'll answer to me, and to God." The deputy backed away, hands raised. "Meant no offense, just doing my duty." "Your duty?" Mateo spat the words. "Where was your duty when they were running her out of town? When they branded her untouchable?" Holt mounted quickly, looking uncomfortable. "Times were different then." "Nothing's different except some folks found their conscience." Mateo watched the deputy turn his horse. "You ride back and tell them, anyone comes up here meaning harm, they'll find more trouble than they bargained for." As Holt's horse disappeared into the mist, Mateo heard the cabin door open. Mary Ellen stood there, pale but composed, Tommy hovering protectively at her elbow. "He's right about one thing," she said softly. "The fever's back in town. Don't you fret about town fever." Mateo crossed to her, taking her cold hands in his. "You're getting stronger every day." She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps we should postpone the wedding until the talk dies down." "No." Mateo's voice was firm. "We're getting married proper, like we planned. Ain't letting fear rule us anymore." They spent the afternoon as usual. Mary Ellen sewing, Tommy practicing his letters, Mateo working on the shelf. But tension hung in the air like the mountain mist, thick and cloying. As evening approached, Mary Ellen rose to start supper. She had taken 3 steps toward the hearth when the coughing began. It started small, just a tickle that made her clear her throat. Then it deepened, became wet and harsh. She fumbled for her handkerchief as the spasm took hold. "Mary Ellen?" Tommy's voice was high with fear. She couldn't answer. The cough racked her slim frame, doubling her over. When she pulled the handkerchief away, bright spots of blood stained the white cloth. Mateo was across the room in 2 strides. He caught her as her knees buckled, lifting her easily in his arms. "Tommy, run to Nowlan's camp. Tell her we need help." The boy bolted out the door as Mateo carried Mary Ellen to their bed. Her breathing came in wheezing gasps between coughs. "I'm sorry," she managed. "The dress still needs—" "Hush now." Mateo's voice was gentle, but his hands shook as he tucked blankets around her. "Dress can wait." Tommy returned with Nowlan 2 feathers before the sun had fully set. She carried her medicine bag and a clay pot of water. "How long has the blood come?" she asked, mixing herbs in a cup. "Just started," Mateo said. He hadn't left Mary Ellen's side, one hand clasped in hers. Nowlan nodded, helping Mary Ellen sip the bitter tea. "Good. We catch it early." She turned to Tommy, who hovered anxiously nearby. "Bring more water, younger brother. Then pray hard to your God." Tommy filled every pot and bucket, then knelt by the bed. His small voice rose clear and determined in the growing dark. "Dear God, please make Mary Ellen better. Please don't take her away. She's the only mama I got now." Mateo's throat tightened at the words. He watched Mary Ellen's face in the lamplight, so pale, but still beautiful, still his miracle. The night stretched endless. Nowlan made tea after tea, adding different herbs each time. Mary Ellen dozed fitfully between coughing spells, her breathing shallow and quick. Tommy fell asleep eventually, curled in Mateo's chair by the fire. But Mateo stayed awake, counting each of Mary Ellen's breaths like prayers. Near midnight, she opened her eyes. "Mateo, I'm here." He squeezed her hand gently. "If I don't—" She had to stop, catching her breath. "If I don't get better, don't." His voice was rough. "You're going to be fine. Listen." Her fingers tightened on his. "If I don't make it, you take care of Tommy. Don't let him go to an orphanage." Tears burned in Mateo's eyes. "You're not going anywhere. We're getting married in 2 days, remember?" She managed a weak smile. "Still need to fix your tie." "That's right." He brought her hand to his lips. "So you rest now. Get strong." Nolan dozed in the corner, but woke whenever Mary Ellen's breathing changed. She worked tirelessly through the night, brewing medicines, bathing Mary Ellen's forehead with cool cloths, murmuring prayers in Apache. The hours crept by like years. Mateo's back ached from sitting rigid in the chair, but he refused to move. He watched the rise and fall of Mary Ellen's chest, willing each breath to come easier than the last. Finally, false dawn began to paint the windows gray. Mary Ellen's eyes fluttered open. "Water?" she whispered. Mateo helped her drink, noting with relief that her breathing seemed less labored. Her skin felt cooler under his hand. "Feel a little better?" she said softly. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "Thank the Creator," Nolan murmured, checking Mary Ellen's pulse. "The fever breaks." Tommy stirred in his chair, blinking sleepily. "Is Mary Ellen okay?" "She's mending, little one," Nolan smiled. "Your prayers were heard." Outside, the mountain mist thickened, wrapping the cabin in gray silence. But inside, hope began to spark again like the first rays of dawn. Mary Ellen's fingers found Mateo's. "Sorry I scared you," she whispered. He shook his head, unable to speak past the knot in his throat. Everything he feared most had stalked through the dark hours of night, losing her like he'd lost Clara, watching helpless as sickness stole another love away. But morning had come. She was still here, still fighting. And he would fight beside her, against illness and prejudice both, for however long they had. Tommy crawled onto the bed, careful not to jostle Mary Ellen. "Can I read to you?" he asked. "While you rest?" She smiled. "I'd like that very much." As Tommy's childish voice stumbled through the Bible verses, Mateo watched the sun slowly burn away the mist outside. Whatever shadow of fear the deputy's warning had brought, whatever darkness the night had held, they had weathered it together. But as he studied Mary Ellen's wan face against the pillows, he couldn't quite shake the cold knot of worry in his gut. The wedding was in 2 days. Would she be strong enough? And what if the miners' fears brought trouble to their celebration? Nolan seemed to read his thoughts. She touched his shoulder gently. "One battle at a time, brother," she murmured. "Today we give thanks for healing. Tomorrow will bring its own medicine." Morning sunlight streamed through the glass windows, catching dust motes in its golden beams. Mary Ellen sat at her sewing table, fingers trembling slightly as she worked on her wedding dress. Mateo watched her from the doorway, noting the shadows under her eyes. "We should wait," he said quietly. "Give you time to get your strength back." She looked up, determination bright in her tired eyes. "No, Mateo, please. I want this wedding now while I still can." "Don't talk that way." His voice roughened. "We both know what this sickness means." She touched the fabric gently. "I want to be your wife proper, before the Lord, even if it's just for a little while." Mateo's chest tightened, but he couldn't deny her. "All right then, but you rest more today." Instead, she insisted on helping prepare for tomorrow's guests. The afternoon found them all in the kitchen, flour dusting the air as they baked bread. Tommy proudly kneaded the dough while Mary Ellen taught him her mother's recipe. "Like this?" he asked, pressing his small hands into the soft mass. "Perfect." She smiled, then laughed as Mateo got flour on his nose. But as evening approached, the laughter faded. Mary Ellen grew paler, her movements slower. She stood by the hearth, stirring soup, when suddenly the wooden spoon clattered to the floor. "Mary Ellen!" Mateo lunged forward as she crumpled. Blood stained her lips crimson. Her breathing came in wet, rattling gasps. "Tommy, ride fast as you can. Get Henry Two Feathers and the preacher." Mateo's voice shook as he cradled Mary Ellen. "Now, boy!" Tommy ran out, leaving the cabin door swinging. Hours crawled by like years. Mateo held Mary Ellen, wiping blood from her chin, whispering prayers he'd forgotten he knew. When hoofbeats finally approached, Henry Two Feathers and Preacher Garrison hurried in. Henry examined her carefully, mixing medicines, while the preacher prayed. But when Henry met Mateo's eyes, he shook his head grimly. "Let me see the stars," Mary Ellen whispered. Mateo gathered her in his arms, blankets and all, carrying her to her beloved window room. He settled into the rocking chair, holding her close as moonlight silvered her pale face. "My brave husband," she breathed, touching his cheek. "I'm right here," he murmured, voice breaking. "I've got you." Through the cabin's glass panes, dawn crept pale and gray. Fresh snow began falling, each flake drifting like a whispered prayer in the stillness. The hearth fire popped and crackled, casting warm light across the worn floorboards where Tommy slept, curled beneath a quilt. Mary Ellen lay in Mateo's arms in the rocking chair, her breathing shallow but peaceful. Her face, though drawn with exhaustion, held a gentle serenity. Outside, the pine boughs started collecting snow, their dark needles turning white in the early morning light. "Mateo," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the falling snow. Her blue eyes found his, bright with unshed tears. "You gave me the 1 year I prayed for, to know love that doesn't fear touch." He tightened his hold on her, feeling the fragile warmth of her body through the quilts. Her hand, resting in his, felt light as a bird's wing. "Mary Ellen," he breathed, but no other words would come. Her fingers slipped from his grasp as softly as the snow settling on the windowsill. The spark in her eyes dimmed, like a candle gracefully burning its last. Her chest stilled. Something broke inside Mateo then, a dam of grief held back since his youth. Tears spilled down his weathered cheeks as he pulled her close, his shoulders shaking with sobs he couldn't contain. The sound of his weeping filled the quiet cabin. Henry Two Feathers stood by the hearth, head bowed, tears tracking silently down his face. Beside him, Nalin pressed her hand to her mouth, shoulders trembling as she wept for the friend who had bridged their two worlds with needle and thread. Tommy stirred at the sound. The boy rose and knelt beside the rocking chair, his young voice lifting in Mary Ellen's favorite hymn. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Through the glass windows, sunlight finally broke over the ridge, painting the snow-covered valley in hues of rose and gold. The first light of morning touched Mary Ellen's face, peaceful in eternal sleep, while the snow continued its gentle descent, covering the world in pristine white. The leather-bound journal lay hidden beneath Mary Ellen's sewing basket, its pages worn soft from frequent handling. Mateo discovered it while sorting through her things 2 days after laying her to rest. His rough hands trembled as he opened the cover. Inside, each entry began the same way. My dearest Mateo. His vision blurred as he realized she had been writing to him all along. Page after page held her neat script, filled with verses from scripture that spoke of hope and healing. She wrote of their daily life together, the way sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, Tommy's laughter as he chased chickens, the peace she found in their mountain home. The Lord blessed me with this one precious year, she wrote. Each day was a gift I never expected to receive. Her words spoke of love without reservation, forgiveness for those who had shunned her, and gratitude for the family she had found. The final entry, dated just days before her passing, made Mateo's heart catch. My beloved husband, when I am gone, please don't let our home become silent again. The cabin has known such joy. Let it become a refuge for others who need shelter from life's storms. The sick, the forgotten, those who have lost their way. There is room enough for all under God's sky. Mateo spent the next weeks fulfilling her first wish, carefully preparing her final resting place beside the wildflower meadow where they had often walked. His hands, skilled from years of working wood, carved her name into a cross of seasoned pine. Below it, he added the words, "Beloved wife, who taught love casts out fear." Henry Two Feathers and his sister Nylon helped him clear new ground around the cabin. Together they built additional sleeping quarters, a larger kitchen, and a covered area for gathering. Word spread through the valley. There was sanctuary to be found at Creed's cabin. They came slowly at first. Apache widows with small children, miners hurt in cave-ins, wandering souls with nowhere else to turn. Each evening, as lamplight glowed from the cabin windows, Mateo would stand by Mary Ellen's cross and whisper, "Your dream lives on, beloved." Spring breathed new life into the mountain hollow. The morning sun caught dewdrops on fresh sprouted grass as wagons wound their way up the trail to what was now called the Mary Ellen Mission. The cabin, expanded through winter's labors, stood welcoming with its new wings spread like protective arms. Preacher Garrison stood before the gathered crowd. The first time settlers and Apache families had come together in these hills. His voice carried across the meadow, strong with conviction that had been absent in earlier days. "This place," he declared, "stands as testament to the power of love over fear, of mercy over judgment. Let the Mary Ellen Mission be a beacon of hope for all who seek refuge." Children darted between the adults, their laughter mixing with birdsong. Colorful quilts, sewn by both, settler and native women, fluttered on lines strung between pine trees. The sound of hymns rose from dozens of voices, filling the valley with harmony that knew no boundaries of race or station. Mateo moved among the people, his lean frame showing the wear of endless labor, but his eyes bright with purpose. In the workshop he'd built, he taught young boys to shape wood into useful things. At mealtimes, he carried bowls of stew to those too weak to rise from their beds. Each evening, he read aloud from Mary Ellen's journal, her words of faith and forgiveness touching hearts that had once been hardened. When the traveling doctor arrived that afternoon, his news struck Mateo like summer lightning. The type of consumption Mary Ellen carried, the physician explained, studying his medical texts, was not the contagious strain. It couldn't have spread to others. He shook his head sadly. Fear and isolation likely hastened her decline more than the disease itself. Mateo stood rigid, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. The truth of it, that his beloved had been innocent of the very thing that had condemned her, threatened to break him anew. But there, among the blooming wildflowers where he had laid her to rest, he dropped to his knees. Instead of rage at the injustice, his whispered prayer spoke of peace and the grace she had always shown. "Your love," he murmured, touching the carved cross, "was stronger than their fear, Mary Ellen, and it still is." Late summer painted the Colorado highlands in rich golds and purples. Mateo walked the wildflower meadow with Tommy beside him, the boy's shoulders broader now, his stride longer after a year of mountain living. They carried wooden crosses, each one carved with care, marking both the souls who had found healing at the mission and those who had passed on to glory. "This spot here," Mateo said, pointing to a patch of purple asters. "Reckon that'd be good for Mr. Johnson's marker. He sure loved them mountain flowers." Tommy nodded, his young face solemn with understanding beyond his years. He helped dig the hole and set the cross straight, just as Mary Ellen had taught him. Everything done with care and respect. The sounds of life drifted down from the mission buildings. Children's laughter mixing with the rhythm of work songs. Some voices lifted hymns in English, others in Apache, the languages weaving together like the patterns in Mary Ellen's quilts. Through the open windows of the infirmary, Nayland's voice could be heard teaching young girls to mix healing herbs, carrying on the gentle work Mary Ellen had started. When evening approached, Mateo made his way to Mary Ellen's grave. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of amber and rose, flooding the valley with golden light. He settled onto the bench he'd built beneath the young aspen tree, its leaves whispering in the cooling air. From his leather pouch, he drew out a piece of cedar, smooth and fragrant from careful sanding. His knife moved with practiced strokes, each letter carved deep and true. She taught me to touch without fear. The words emerged from the wood just as she had drawn forth the love from his hardened heart. Henry Two Feathers had told him once that grief carried two paths, one of darkness and one of light. Mary Ellen had always chosen light, even in her darkest hours. Now, sitting beside her resting place, Mateo's prayers rose not with sorrow but with quiet gratitude. Gratitude for the brief season they'd shared, for the love that had transformed not just his life, but an entire community. The last rays of sunset set the mountain peaks ablaze. Mateo lifted his eyes to that holy light, his rough fingers tracing the freshly carved words. "You weren't the one who was unclean," he whispered, his voice thick with tenderness. "You were the purest soul God ever sent." Behind him, the mission bell rang out clear and sweet, calling everyone to evening prayers. Soon the chapel would be full. Settlers and natives, the sick and the healing, the young and the old, all gathered together as Mary Ellen had dreamed. Her legacy lived on in every gentle touch, every act of mercy, every bridge built between those who had once stood apart in fear. Mateo stood slowly, tucking the cedar plank close to his heart. Tomorrow he would mount it above her cross, but for now he held it close, just as he held her memory. The wildflowers nodded in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a thrush sang its evening song to the fading day. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.